Hello, dear friends. As a continuation of our series of applied neuroanatomy, today we are going to discuss the anatomy of one of the most complex part of the central nervous system anatomy, which is the brainstem. The brainstem, as you know, is the direct continuation of the spinal cord. As it ascends upwards, it becomes wider and more complex. The brainstem is formed of three parts, from caudal to rostral: the medulla oblongata, which is composed also of two more parts, the closed medulla caudally and the open medulla rostrally, forming the lower half of the floor of the fourth ventricle. The pons forms the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle, and the midbrain is between the pons and the subthalamus, between the brainstem and the brain. It's composed of three parts, from anterior to posterior: the cerebral peduncle, the tegmentum, and the tectum. This is a lateral view of the brainstem, showing the position of the tegmentum, which is a very important part and very crucial part of the brainstem. Most of the medulla, the tegmentum forms the posterior part of the pons and the central part of the midbrain. Gross anatomy of the brainstem, starting by the medulla. The anterior surface of the medulla is composed of an elevation on either side of the anterior median fissure. So we have a fissure in the center called the median fissure, with an elevation on either side called the pyramid. Lateral to the pyramid, we have the olive, representing the inferior olivary nucleus, and separated from the pyramid by the pre-olivary sulcus, containing the roots of the hypoglossal nerve. Also, the olive is separated from another elevation, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, by the post-olivary sulcus, containing the roots of the lower cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. This is an anterior view of the medulla, showing the median sulcus, then the pyramid, and lateral to it is the olive. In the pre-olivary sulcus is the hypoglossal nerve. Post-olivary sulcus is the 9, 10, and 11 cranial nerves. Another view, the pyramids, pyramidal decussation at the lower medulla, lower end of the medulla before the spinal cord, and then lateral to it is the olive, pre-olivary sulcus, hypoglossal roots, post-olivary sulcus, hypoglossal roots, and then posteriorly we have lower down the trigeminal tubercle, and up we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Another view showing the medulla, the fissure, and the elevation. Posterior surface of the medulla, there is a closed part, caudal, and the open part, rostral, as we said, forming the lower half of the floor of the fourth ventricle. The closed part is composed of the gracile and cuneate tubercles on either side of the midline, median fissure, and then the gracile tubercle, then the cuneate tubercle, and lateral to the cuneate is the trigeminal tubercle. This is in the closed medulla. The rostral half, open medulla, is composed of the hypoglossal triangle medially and above, and the vagal triangle laterally and below, and the vestibular area lateral to them. So this is the posterior surface of the medulla. The closed medulla, having a central canal, contains the gracile. Lateral to it is the cuneate. Lateral to it is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, up, or the trigeminal tubercle below. The open medulla, we have in the midline the median sulcus, and lateral to it, above and medial, we have the hypoglossal triangle, which is the site of the hypoglossal nucleus. Below and lateral to it is the vagal triangle, which is the site of the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. And the open medulla is separated from the pons, posterior surface of the pons, by transverse fibers called the stria medullaris, or the posterior part of the external arcuate fibers, as we will see. The pons is 2.5 centimeter structure between the medulla inferiorly and the midbrain superiorly, separated from the medulla and from the the mesencephalon, the midbrain, by the inferior and superior pontine fissures. The pons is broadly divided into two parts, the basilar part ventral and the tegmental part dorsal. It contains the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves, 5, 6, 7, and 8. The anterior surface of the pons contains a shallow groove in the midline, named the basilar groove, harboring the basilar artery. On either side of the transverse of the basilar groove, there are transverse pontine fibers curving laterally and posteriorly, forming the middle cerebellar peduncle or the brachii pontis. So this is the picture of the pons. There is a shallow groove here called the basilar groove, shallow groove for the basilar artery called the shallow groove, the basilar groove, and laterally there are the transverse pontine fibers which will form the middle cerebellar peduncle in its way to the cerebellum. We see here also that at the junction between the pons and the medulla, the sixth nerve arises from the pontomedullary fissure near the midline, and lateral to it in the same horizontal plane, 7 and 8 at the pontomedullary fissure, but more laterally. And the trigeminal arises, root comes from the mid-lateral pons. Posterior surface of the pons, it forms the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle, separated from the open medulla by the posterior external arcuate fibers, which are extending from the cochlear area, the cochlear nuclei, to the median sulcus. These fibers are also called the stria medullaris. Not the stria medullaris thalami, stria medullaris, full stop. In the middle of the pons, posteriorly, there is the median sulcus, and lateral to it is the median eminence. Lateral to the median eminence, the sulcus limitans, and lateral to it, the vestibular area. The lower part of the median eminence is called the facial colliculus, which is the term of the facial nerve fibers around the abducent nucleus, as we will see in cross-section. So, we are talking about the pons, we talk about the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle, we talk about the median fissure, then the medial eminence, and then lateral, the sulcus limitans laterally, and the vestibular area. And the lower part of the medial eminence is the facial colliculus. Another view, posterior surface of the pons, separated from the open medulla by the stria medullaris, the median sulcus, and the medial eminence, lateral to it, the sulcus limitans, lateral to it, the vestibular area. The lower part of the medial eminence is the facial colliculus. Talking about the midbrain, is the rostral part of the brainstem. From anterior to posterior, it is composed of the cerebral peduncle, basis pedunculi, the tegmentum, as we saw before, and the tectum, which is formed of the superior and inferior colliculi. Around the lateral surface of the midbrain turns three important structures. Two, they come from anterior to posterior, and one from posterior to anterior. Those coming from anterior to posterior around the lateral surface of the midbrain are the optic tract and the posterior cerebral artery. Optic tract on their way to form the optic radiation, and they relay in the lateral geniculate body, posterior cerebral terminal branch of the basilar, going around the brainstem to supply the medial surface of the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. And the trochlear nerve, which is the only nerve arising from the posterior surface of the brainstem, below the inferior colliculus, twins around the lateral surface of the midbrain from posterior to anterior. So three structures crossing lateral to the midbrain. Midbrain contains also two nuclei of the cranial nerves, the third and the fourth. The anterior surface of the midbrain is composed, as we said, of two cerebral peduncles, forming the posterolateral boundary of the interpeduncular fossa, and the third nerve exits medial to the cerebral peduncle. So this is the view. This is the cross cerebri, basis pedunculi, basis pedunculi or cerebral peduncle, and the oculomotor exits medial to it, and this is the interpeduncular fossa, which is not a part of the midbrain, and the posterolateral boundary of the interpeduncular fossa is the cerebral peduncle and the midbrain. The anterolateral is the optic tract, which is not also a part of the midbrain. So in the midbrain here we have the cerebral peduncle, the basis pedunculi, and the oculomotor nerve. Posterior surface of the midbrain is called the tectum of the midbrain or the quadrigeminal plate. It is composed of two superior colliculi connected to the lateral geniculate bodies and involved in the visual process, as we'll see in another video, and two inferior colliculi connected to the medial geniculate bodies and involved in the hearing process. It contains, as we said, the only nerve that exits from the posterior surface of the brainstem, which is the trochlear nerve. So here we have the tectum of the midbrain, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. The inferior colliculus going to laterally to the medial geniculate body, superior colliculus going to the lateral geniculate body, which is a part of the metathalamus. And we have the pineal gland above the colliculi. And we have the trochlear nerve arising below the inferior colliculus, crossing to the opposite side in the superior medullary velum and winding around the lateral surface of the midbrain on its way to the tentorial hiatus and then to the cavernous sinus to supply the superior oblique muscle. Quick review of the brainstem again: median sulcus, pyramid, olive, pre-olivary sulcus, hypoglossal nerve, post-olivary sulcus 9, 10, and 11, pons, shallow groove, the basilar groove, then the trigeminal nerve from the lateral mid-pons, and at the pontomedullary fissure, medially the abducent nerve, the sixth nerve, and laterally 7th and 8th cranial nerves. The 6th nerve is the same horizontal plane with 7 and 8, and the 7 and 8 are on the same horizontal plane as 9, 10, and 11, which is of utmost importance in surgery of the hemifacial spasm. And sometimes you can miss in acoustic neuromas, big ones, so the 6th for the 7th and 8th. Also here, the cerebral peduncle, right and left, oculomotor nerve, trochlear, winding around the lateral brainstem. From posterior, the median sulcus, the gracile cuneate tubercles, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the open medulla, the median fissure. We have here the vagal triangle, hypoglossal triangle, vestibular area, and stria medullaris. Here the facial colliculus, the median eminence, the median sulcus, the medial eminence, the sulcus limitans, and vestibular area. Internal structures of the brain. The best way to study the internal structures of the brainstem is to divide the brainstem from caudal to rostral into medulla, pons, and midbrain, and to further subdivide the anatomy into peripheral, midline, and paramedian structures, and to correlate the peripheral structures with the gross anatomy we just studied now, as we'll see, I'll show you, then to identify the level and site of the cranial nerves and the nuclei, and the trigeminal nerve has nuclei all through the brainstem. So this is the general plan we are going to use in studying cross sections or internal structures of the brainstem. There are 3 parts, upper and lower parts in each one, and then there are peripheral, midline, paramedian parts. Correlate the peripheral parts with the gross anatomy, identify the level and site of the cranial nerve nuclei and their exit points, and that the trigeminal nerve has nuclei all through the brainstem. The medulla, we start by the medulla, is divided into closed medulla caudally and open medulla rostrally, forming the lower floor of the fourth ventricle, and the medulla contains the nuclei of the lower 4 cranial nerves. So this is a cross section in the closed medulla. We have the central canal here. We find the gracile medially, gracile tract and tubercle, gracile nucleus, and the cuneate nuclei which give rise to the second order neuron. We do have a sensory decussation, or the internal arcuate fibers crossing to the other side, forming the medial limniscus. So gracile, lower limb, cuneate, upper limb, nuclei receive the gracile cuneate tracts and send internal arcuate fibers or sensory decussation in the closed medulla, upper closed medulla, forming the medial limniscus. Lateral to it, we find the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal, and we find the trigeminal tract, spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And as we said, anteriorly we have an elevation of the pyramid with the arcuate nucleus. Lateral to it, we should have the olive, but we have in this part of the medulla, the lower medulla, we have the inferior liver nucleus part of it, and here we should have the inferior cerebellar peduncle, but we have dorsal and ventral spinothalamic, dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts before going into the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So again, also in the midline, we have central structure always present in the midline together with the medial limniscus, which is the medial longitudinal bundle, which is connecting fibers from different nuclei of the cranial nerves, responsible for the movement, harmonization of the movement of the eyes with the movement of the head and the movement of the neck. It's very important. We call the present all through the central brainstem. So centrally we have always the medial limniscus and the medial longitudinal bundle or fasciculus. Why it's not called the tract? Because it contains ascending and descending fibers at the same time. That's it. This is the level of the closed medulla, and posteriorly here we find the nucleus of taste, nucleus solitarius. Anteriorly, near the midline, we have the hypoglossal nucleus, motor nucleus, and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. This is the closed medulla. Open medulla, again, we find medially the hypoglossal. Remember the hypoglossal triangle in the level of the floor of the fourth ventricle? Medially, this is the hypoglossal nucleus. Lateral to it, dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and lateral to it is the nucleus solitarius, or the nucleus of taste. And then after we have the vestibular area. If you remember the floor, hypoglossal triangle, hypoglossal nucleus. Vagal triangle, dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. Lateral to it, the vestibular area, and the solitary here. Anteriorly, we have the pyramid with the arcuate nucleus, and then the olive harboring the inferior olivary nucleus, and it is an extrapyramidal system, part of the system, and responsible for the tone and posture. Between the pyramid and the olive, we have the pre-olivary sulcus, and then we have the post-olivary sulcus, and then we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So we can correlate all the peripheral structures of the medulla with the cross-section. Pyramid, olive, inferior cerebellar peduncle, posteriorly the hypoglossal nucleus, dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, vestibular area, nucleus solitarius, and in the midline, as we said, we have the medial limniscus and we have the medial longitudinal bundle or fasciculus. Also lateral to the vestibular area is the cochlear area. The pons is divided also into lower and upper pons, contains nuclei of 4 cranial nerves, trigeminal, abducent, facial, and vestibulocochlear. It contains 2 nuclei of 5 which exits at the lateral mid pons. So 2 nuclei of the trigeminal are present in the pons. 1 nucleus was present in the medulla, we'll see it now later on. 2 nuclei present in the level of the pons, and 1 nucleus of trigeminal is present at the level of the midbrain. So this is the lower pons, you remember, correlate with the anatomy, gross anatomy. So we have here the sixth nerve, you remember. It arises at the pontomedullary fissure, more near the midline. 7 and 8 are lateral to it, but the 7 fascial nucleus forms a turn around, the fibers form a turn around the abducent nucleus, and before exiting outside, this turn is called the fascial colliculus, which is the lower part of the medial eminence, as we said. And we have anteriorly the shallow groove for the basilar, we have the transverse pontine fibers, we have the pontine nuclei, which are the pyramidal fibers of the pyramidal tract coming from the cerebral peduncle down to the medulla to form the pyramid. We have here the trapezoid body, and we have here the medial lemniscus, and we'll find the medial longitudinal fasciculus also. And as you all know that the middle cerebellar peduncle is the most lateral and the biggest, and medial to it, covering the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the superior cerebellar peduncle up. If you go another cross section through the upper part of the pons, what we'll find also the pontine nuclei, the transverse pontine fibers, and the corticospinal, corticobulbar tracts traversed by the transverse pontine fibers anteriorly, and posteriorly what we'll find, we will find the rostral part of the fourth of the ventricle. We have here the superior medullary vena, and we'll have here midline structures, the medial lemniscus and the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and we'll find the two nuclei of the trigeminal nerve we are talking about, which is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal, which is supplying the muscles of mastication, and we have the main sensory nucleus, which is carrying touch from the face. So the medulla carried the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal. Here we have the motor nucleus and the main sensory nucleus carrying touch from the face. The midbrain is divided into lower midbrain and upper midbrain, contains the nuclei of the third and fourth cranial nerves. It is divided from back to front into tectum, tegmentum, basis, pedunculi. Tectum, tegmentum, basis, pedunculi. This is the caudal part of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculus, and anteriorly we have grossly the cerebral peduncle. So this is the cerebral peduncle, which is containing the pyramidal fibers, pyramid. The laterally is the temporopontine fibers, and medially the frontopontine fibers, and in the midline corticospinal, corticonuclear, corticobulbar. So the midline is going to the medulla, but laterally is going to the pons, and medially going into the nuclei of the pons. But in the middle part, the pyramidal are going to the cord and going to the nuclei of the medulla. And after that, we find a dark structure here called the substantia nigra, which is involved in the extrapyramidal system, and it has a pathway, what we call the nigrostriatal pathway. It is secreting dopamine between, there is a pathway between the substantia nigra and the lentiform nucleus. Secreting dopamine, its deficiency results in Parkinsonism, and there is also a striatonigral pathway from the corpus striatum, from the lentiform nucleus to the substantia nigra, secreting acetylcholine. And its increase causes also Parkinsonism. So to treat Parkinsonism, either give dopaminergic drugs to enhance this pathway, or anticholinergic to reduce this pathway. Also, at the level of the inferior colliculus, of course, we have the inferior colliculus, and then we get the aqueduct, the periaqueductal region. We get here the trochlear nerve, the nucleus of the trochlear nerve. As we said, it crosses to the opposite side in the superior medullary verum, supplying the contralateral muscle. And also there is a decussation here of the superior cerebellar peduncle. As we said, it decussates to the opposite side. And we have the limnisci, almost more or less in the midline and medial longitudinal bundle. Also we have the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal. So again, the cerebral peduncles, crus cerebri, temporopontine, frontopontine, cortico-spinal, and cortico-bulbar. We have the decussation of superior cerebellar peduncle, have the substantia nigra, we have the limnisci, we have the trochlear nerve, where fibers crossing in the superior medullary verum to the opposite side. We have the inferior colliculi, and we have the aqueduct and the mesencephalic nucleus on either side of the aqueduct. The rostral midbrain level of the superior colliculus. We have also the central canal. We have the periaqueductal region responsible for pain. Deep brain stimulation here can reduce the pain. And we have in the midline also the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and we have the limnisci all together on either side, the trigeminal limniscus with the medial limniscus and the spinal limniscus. Also, a very important structure present here, cerebral peduncle, as we said. We said the temporopontine, frontopontine fibers and the corticospinal fibers, the substantia nigra. There is the red nucleus. The red nucleus is a part also of the extrapyramidal system, what we call the dentato-rubro-thalamo frontopontocerebellar pathway, if you remember, in the cerebellum. So it takes from the dentate nucleus and it goes to the thalamus, the anterior ventral nucleus of the thalamus. As we have a cranial nerve in the lower midbrain, we have another one in the upper midbrain, which is the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. And we have some tegmental decussation, the tegmentum, ventral tegmental decussation, dorsal tegmental decussation, and the limnisci. So again, rostral midbrain, anteriorly we have the frontopontine fibers, temporoparieto-occipitopontine fibers, corticospinal, corticonuclear, all forming the cerebral peduncle, and then the substantia nigra, and then the red nucleus, then the ventral tegmental decussation, dorsal tegmental decussation in the midline, medial longitudinal fasciculus, and the medial and the limnisci gathered together, becoming a bit lateral, the trigeminal, the spinal, and the medial limniscus. And this is the central canal. The central canal is called periaqueductal region and the periaqueductal gray matter. And we have here the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The midline structures, as we said, and as you know, always the medial limniscus and the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The paramedian structures, not peripheral, not central, paramedian. The brainstem structures in the spinal cord. From the medulla, we have the nuclei, different nuclei, vestibular nuclei forming the vestibulospinal, olivospinal, reticulospinal, and the ascending tracts, the spino-vestibular, spino-olivary, spino-reticular. From the midbrain, rubrospinal, red nucleus, tectospinal from the tectum. Paramedian structures also, as we will see now, the medial, lateral, trigeminal, and spinal limnisci, and the nuclei of the cranial nerves, nuclei of the extrapyramidal, and the visceral nuclei. Also, it contains 3 decussations, the brainstem, pyramidal or motor in the lower medulla, as we saw it before, sensory or proprioception, the internal arcuate fibers at the upper medulla, and the superior cerebellar at the lower midbrain, superior cerebellar peduncle decussation. The cranial nerve nuclei, we can see them rapidly. The motor are on the right hand and the sensory on the left hand. The motor Here is the cervical cord, the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The cervical cord, we have one important nucleus, the spinal nucleus of the accessory. The spinal accessory nerve arises from anterior horn cells of the upper 5 or 6 cervical segments. So this is first motor nucleus of the cranial nerve. And then we go in the medulla, we get medially the hypoglossal nucleus supplying the muscles of the tongue, and then lateral to it we get the nucleus ambiguous, which is supplying the nuclei of the glossopharyngeal, of the vagus, and the cranial accessory. And they call the bronchosomatic, supplying the muscles of the pharynx, muscles of the larynx, and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, which is supplying parasympathetic supply to the lungs, to the heart, and to the GIT. This is also, we have another two brainstem nuclei, one in the pons called the superior salivary nucleus, which is parasympathetic of the facial, and in the medulla we have the inferior salivary nucleus, which is the parasympathetic for the glossopharyngeal. Also we have the motor of the face and the motor of the trigeminal. This is the muscles of the face, muscles of mastication, and we have also in the pons the abducent nerve, which is supplying the lateral rectus muscle, and in the midbrain we have two motor nerves, the trochlear nerve supplying the superior oblique muscle, and the oculomotor nerve supplying most of the muscles of the eye, as we'll see later on. On the left-hand side, we have the nuclei, the sensory nuclei. Very, very important, visceral, the only important visceral sensory nucleus, which is the nucleus tolitarius of taste, receiving fibers mainly from the glossopharyngeal, posterior third of the tongue, facial, anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and the epiglottis by the vagus. And then one important sensory nucleus, which is the nuclei of the trigeminal. In the medulla and upper cervical region, we get the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal carrying pain and temperature. So sometimes when you get a cervical, high cervical lesion can cause pain in one side of the face, the ipsilateral side of the face. Also, in the pons, we find a sensory nucleus, which is the main sensory nucleus, touch from the face, and in the midbrain, the mesencephalic nucleus carrying the proprioceptive sensation from the face. Other sensory fibers, sensory cranial nerve nuclei, are the acoustic or the cochlear for hearing, the cochlear nuclei, and the vestibular nuclei for balance. So again, motor nuclei, accessory, hypoglossal, ambiguous, dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. In the medulla, this is in the spinal cord. Here, the pons, motor nucleus of the trigeminal, motor nucleus of the facial, the abducent, and parasympathetic of the facial, the superior salivary nucleus, supplying the submandibular sublingual salivary glands, and in the medulla also the inferior salivary nucleus, glossopharyngeal nerve supplying the parotid. On the other side, the sensory nuclei, in the medulla, the solitary nucleus, in the medulla and upper cervical cord, the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal, pain and temperature, in the pons, the main sensory nucleus carrying touch, and in the midbrain, the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal carrying proprioception. Also, in the level of the pons, we have the cochlear nuclei receiving hearing, and the vestibular nuclei receiving balance from the semicircular canals and the utricle and the sacral. another view of the cranial nerves and their nuclei. This is another view. Let's go again. In the medulla we have the hypoglossal, dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and the nucleus ambiguus. These are all on the right side of the motor nerves. And then you go in the medulla, we have the inferior salivary nucleus, glossopharyngeal for the parotid, superior salivary nucleus, facial for the submandibular, sublingual salivary glands. We get the motor nucleus of the facial, and we get the abducent nucleus, and we get the motor nucleus of the trigeminal. If you go in the midbrain, you get in the lower midbrain the trochlear nucleus, upper midbrain, the oculomotor nucleus, the parasympathetic part of it, Edinger Westphal nucleus. These are the motor nuclei. On the left-hand side, you have the sensory nuclei, the most important taste nucleus, visceral sensation, nucleus solitarius, and then we get the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal in the cord, in the medulla, and then we get the main sensory nucleus in the pons, which is carrying touch from the face, and the mesencephalic nucleus in the midbrain carrying the deep sensation from the face. Also here we have in the pons the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei, vestibular medially, cochlear laterally. This is a quiz. Let's solve it together. What is this? Present in the cervical region. Yes, the anterior horn cell, the nuclei of the spinal part of the accessory nerve, and this is motor and this is sensory. As we go up, we get, yes, this is the hypoglossal nucleus, then the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and then you get the nucleus ambiguus, upper half, upper part glossopharyngeal, the main part vagus, lower part cranial accessory. And then we get two nuclei, visceral, parasympathetic nuclei, one superior in the pons, superior salivary nucleus, facial, submandibular, sublingual salivary glands, and one inferior salivary nucleus, the parasympathetic, through the glossopharyngeal to the parotid. And then in the pons also, we find the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, and it forms fibers around the abducent, forming the facial colliculus. And also in the pons, we find the motor nucleus here, which is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Other two motor nuclei, inferior midbrain trochlear nucleus and superior midbrain oculomotor, and the parasympathetic oculomotor Edinger Westphal. The left side, the tractus solitarius, the solitary nucleus, then the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal, then the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal with the motor nucleus in the pons, then the main sensory nucleus of the trigeminal with the motor nucleus of the pons, and then the mesencephalic nucleus in the midbrain. This is pain and temperature, this is for touch, main sensory nucleus, and this is for the deep sensation. And the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei. Extrapyramidal nuclei, including the reticular. People consider, many scientists consider the reticular part of the extrapyramidal system. So this is to show you the extrapyramidal nuclei scattered in the brain, the putamen globus pallidus, the dentate nucleus, and in the brainstem we have also the brainstem. In the medulla we have part of the extrapyramidal system, the inferior olive. Also in the medulla, the medial, lateral, superior and inferior vestibular nuclei. These are extrapyramidal. And in the pons, we have part of the reticular system, the locus ceruleus. And the red nucleus present in the midbrain is part of the extrapyramidal system, and the substantia nigra is a part of the extrapyramidal system. So the extrapyramidal nuclei in the medulla is the inferior olive, part of the reticular system, the raphe nuclei, raphe magnus, in also the vestibular nuclei. and we go into the pons, we get the locus ceruleus, and we get mainly the locus ceruleus, and we go to the midbrain. We find the red nucleus should be in the midbrain, and then we get the substantia nigra. These are extrapyramidal nuclei. Again, here in the medulla, inferior olive, olivocerebellar pathway, part of the extrapyramidal system. And as we go up, we find the substantia nigra, we find the red nucleus sending different nuclei. The reticular nuclei, the raphe magnus, as we said, is for pain, mainly in the medulla, locus ceruleus in the pons, also for the treatment of pain, or it is concerned with the ascending pathway of pain, and the tegmental nuclei, which are also reticular nuclei, extrapyramidal system, sending continuous impulses to the hypothalamus and cerebral cortex for wakefulness. So if you have an intact cerebral cortex with affected tegmental nuclei, the patient will pass into deep coma because the continuous impulsing of waves from the brainstem to the cerebral cortex stopped, and from the brainstem to the hypothalamus stopped. This is the site where is the reticular formation in the medulla, the open medulla. It's present either side of the midline. Also in the pons, the same way, and in the midbrain, the same way. This is the site of the reticular formation, always paramedian, near the midline, forming the tegmental nuclei or the tegmentum. The visceral nuclei include visceral sensory, which is taste here, and the visceral motor, which is the parasympathetic. Also the respiratory and micturition nuclei are concerned with the viscera, so they are called visceral nuclei. So the visceral brainstem nuclei: sensory, motor, respiratory, and micturition. The visceral sensory is the nucleus solitarius, as we said before, receiving from 7, 9, and 10 cranial nerves. The parasympathetic or the visceral motor include the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, the superior salivary nucleus of the facial, inferior salivary nucleus of the glossopharyngeal, and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. So these are the visceral nuclei, the nucleus solitarius here, and then we have the area prostrema, we have the superior inferior salivary nuclei, we have the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and we have visceral nuclei also, the pontine micturition center, which is present posteriorly on either side of the midline, and the pneumotaxic center and the apnostic center, which are visceral centers concerned with respiration, as we'll see later. So when we talk about the visceral nuclei, the visceral sensory, nucleus solitarius, the visceral motor, which is the parasympathetic, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, the superior and inferior salivary nuclei, and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. And we talk about reticular formation. It's not the visceral, it's extrapyramidal, sorry. We talk about the centers, one for micturition and one for control of respiration. These are the brainstem visceral nuclei. So why patients develop apnea in posterior fossa surgery? Sometimes if you operate on a tumor adherent to the brainstem surface, adherent to the medulla, you get a fully conscious apneic patient. Why? Because we have respiratory centers, part of the visceral nuclei, the brainstem. This is the cause, the dorsal respiratory group, the inspiratory center, which supplies, the only one supplying the diaphragm. 80% of the respiration is dependent on the diaphragm, and it supplies also the intercostal muscles. So it is very important to initiate respiration by sending impulses to the diaphragm and to the intercostals, and it is present posteriorly, the midline, near the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and it's very dangerous. If you injure it, you get an apneic patient. Less important is another center, the ventral expiratory center, which is also stimulatory, but as you know, expiration is a passive process. It doesn't need a center. It helps to contract, and it supplies only the intercostal muscles, so it's not that important. In the Pons, we find a very, very important center, the apneustic center, which is consisting of a group of visceral nuclei, and they are important producing stimulation of the dorsal respiratory group, and less important, pneumotaxic center producing inhibition of the dorsal respiratory group. So we have also part of the visceral nuclei, as we said, the visceral sensory, the visceral motor parasympathetic, the micturition, and the respiration. This is the respiration. The two most important is the dorsal respiratory group and the apneustic center in the Pons. Again, to remind you of the centers, the apneustic, the micturition, and the taste, and the parasympathetic. The blood supply, the brainstem is supplied by the vertebral-basilar system. The two vertebral arteries unite together, forming the basilar artery, and they give branches before uniting from the vertebra, the anterior spinal artery and the two posterior spinal arteries. And we have the pica. Posterior spinal arteries arise usually from the pica, which is supplying the lateral brainstem, medulla, and the posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. And then we have the ICA, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Sometimes the labyrinthine artery arises from the basilar, sometimes it gives rise to the labyrinthine artery, supplying the 7th and 8th nerves, and the labyrinth responsible for hearing. And the 6th nerve can be present between the ICA and the labyrinthine artery. Also we find pontine arteries on either side supplying the anterior surface of the pons, the transverse pontine fibers, and the basilar ends into dividing into posterior cerebral arteries, superior cerebellar arteries, posterior cerebral, yes, but before division we have the superior cerebellar artery supplying the midbrain and the superior surface of the cerebellum. Between the posterior cerebral and the superior cerebellar exits the oculomotor nerve. Also, the basilar artery gives perforators supplying the brainstem, and the posterior cerebral also gives perforators supplying the brainstem. And this is a circle of Willis, perforators of the basilar. You have the posterior cerebral, the basilar, the superior cerebellar artery. Another view again, vertebra, anterior spinal artery, pica, posterior spinal artery, two vertebrals from the basilar. Basilar forms the ICA. After the ICA, labyrinthine artery, then the transverse pontine arteries, and then the superior cerebellar artery, and then ends in the posterior cerebral artery on either side. And this is a lateral view to show you again that the vertebral form the basilar, and the basilar divides into the posterior cerebral arteries. And from below upwards, we have the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the superior cerebellar artery, all form a turn around the brainstem, reaching the cerebellum. This is where they reach. The pica is supplying the posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. The ICA is supplying the anterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum, and the superior cerebellar artery is supplying the superior surface of the cerebellum. The veins, very important, the posteromedian medullary vein, which continues in the pons as the pontomesencephalic vein, continues up in the interpeduncular fossa at the interpeduncular vein, which drains into the basal vein of Rosenthal, which is formed by the junction of the anterior cerebral and the deep middle cerebral vein lateral to the optic tract. And we also have transverse medullary veins, and we have transverse pontine veins. Posteromedian medullary vein, pontomesencephalic vein, interpeduncular vein, basal vein of Rosenthal, transverse medullary veins, and transverse pontine veins, and the superior petrosal vein is always Y-shaped, inverted Y, and always behind the trigeminal root. This is a view showing the superior vermian vein. We have the inferior vermian vein, and we have here the precentral cerebellar vein. When you do the supracerebellar infratentorial approach, it guides you to where is present the great cerebral vein of Galen. Precentral cerebellar vein drains into the great cerebral vein of Galen. Thank you. I hope, I know that this subject is one of the most difficult areas of the brain, but I hope we made some clarification, some light, and we hope we meet very soon in the next part of the wonders of the anatomy of the central nervous system. Thank you very much.